another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dasha, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 17th issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On the front page this morning, one article is that companies drop the scalpel, pick up a big axe for layoffs by Chip Cutter. Snap is laying off 16% of its staff. Block lopped off 40% of its workforce. Oracle, meanwhile, is shedding thousands of employees after Amazon.com cut about 30,000 in a matter of months. Welcome to the era of the mega layoff. In Silicon Valley and beyond, companies that are cutting staff are doing it with a big axe. Instead of laying off people in more incremental and less disruptive waves, employers are seizing on the potential financial upsides of severing swaths of their workforce at once. That's a departure from not long ago when mass layoffs registered as a sign of trouble or mismanagement, and that a company needed to take drastic measures to right its performance. Now, such a company is more likely to get a big stock bump and praise from investors for acting boldly. Snap was no different. Though shares in the social media company are down 22% over the past year, the company's stock shot up 8% on Wednesday after executives said that it was eliminating 1,000 jobs. Block shares had fallen 16% this year before it laid off 4,000, or nearly half of its employees, in late February. The stock has since reversed those losses and then some. Behind the scenes at Block, something else happened. Leaders from across the corporate world messaged the payments company's top executives, asking for the playbook on how they might replicate such sweeping cuts at their own companies, said Amrita Ahuja, Block's chief financial officer and chief operating officer. We had people kind of coming out of the woodwork, Ahuja said in an interview. Asked if she saw Block's layoffs of 40% of its workforce as a new template, she said, "It's an inevitability. As a CFO, I think it's better to be a little bit early than to be too late here." The willingness to make the big cuts reflects a fundamental shift in how U.S. companies view their professional talent. Instead of competing for knowledge workers with big pay raises and other perks, as many did for much of the past decade, corporate leaders have come to see large teams as impeding progress, not helping it. Most companies, if not all, could cut 30 to 50% of their workforce at any time and see no material difference in performance, said Mo Koifman, founder of the venture capital firm Shine Capital and a former executive at the media company IAC. Sure, artificial intelligence has made some work processes more efficient, allowing for fewer people in some departments, he said, but it's also given air cover, more important, to execute on the right sizing that you probably needed to do a long time ago. So far, the rationale for the cuts appears to be driven less by AI's abilities to replace workers outright than by the soaring costs of building the technology, according to executives. And many companies, particularly in tech, continue to course correct after overhiring during the pandemic. Regardless of the why, executives said, companies are finding a way to slash jobs and are being rewarded by investors for it. Others are going to follow suit, said Beth Steinberg, a veteran human resources executive who spent much of her career at technology companies. A few companies will do it. They'll get praise. That, she said, will encourage other leadership teams to come back to their companies and be like, we have to do huge layoffs. Among white-collar workers in tech and elsewhere, the angst is spreading. Many college-educated workers are finding it increasingly difficult to find new work after losing a job. Over the past 12 months, unemployment among college-educated workers 34 and under has converged and now surpassed the 4.1% rate for people with two-year associate degrees, according to an analysis of Labor Department data by the economist Gad Lebanon. The job security premium of a bachelor's degree has, at least for now, disappeared, he said. Michael Maximilian left his role as a distinguished engineer at International Business Machines last year and has been building a new company, ClawMax, to help people manage AI agents. He said he hears almost daily from tech employees, some at large companies, checking to see if he's hiring. So far, he isn't. He predicts many tech companies will cut teams by 20% to 50% by the end of 2026, if only because he's watching coding tools like Anthropic's Claude Code and OpenAI's Codex advance so rapidly. I think I've met 2 people in 30 years that can do better than Claude Code right now, the 53-year-old said. The models are getting better, so why would I not in a year just get more Claude licenses instead of hiring anybody? If massive layoffs spread, they could become a political flashpoint ahead of the midterm elections. And while much of the pain has been in the tech sector, job cuts are also happening in warehousing, logistics, and other industries that ramped up hiring during the COVID era, said Dana M. Peterson, chief economist at the Conference Board. Meanwhile, apart from fields such as healthcare, hiring in other parts of the economy has largely stalled. If you look elsewhere, no one's hiring, no one's firing, she said. Tariq Shawkat, chief executive of the code verification company Sonar, said he was doubtful AI was replacing most of the people losing jobs. Though AI tools have enabled some employees to reduce tasks to hours instead of days, they must still devote time to correcting AI's mistakes or misinterpretation of data. So I can understand people delaying hiring a little bit, he said. I have a harder time seeing that AI is responsible for the 40% reductions that you're seeing out there. The U.S. plans an industrial hub in the Philippines by Heather Somerville and Georgia Wells. An agreement with the Philippines to establish a high-tech industrial hub is the Trump administration's latest effort to lessen China's dominance over global supply chains. The deal to build up American manufacturing across a stretch of the island of Luzon, signed Thursday, will offer U.S. companies access to essential inputs, such as critical minerals that bypass Beijing's control. The artificial intelligence-powered manufacturing hub is planned for a 4,000-acre site given to the U.S. by Manila, said Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs Jacob Hellberg. The U.S. will occupy the site rent-free and administer it as a special economic zone. The hub will have diplomatic immunity, such as the protections afforded to an American embassy, and operate under U.S. common law, the first arrangement of its kind anywhere in the world. The 2-year lease is renewable for 99 years. The arrangement is a bid to accelerate U.S. manufacturing in defense and other key industries while lessening China's chokehold on critical minerals and other key components for electronics, building on the Trump administration's agenda to bring more of the supply chain under American control. You can't build anything in Ohio if the minerals and processed materials are controlled by an adversary who can cut you off tomorrow, Hellberg said in an interview. The process also deepens the U.S.'s economic and political ties with a key ally in Southeast Asia, facing pressure from China's regional military presence. China has stepped up its aggressive tactics against Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, among other maritime threats. The Presidential Communications Office in Manila didn't respond to a request for comment. The planned manufacturing hub is largely conceptual at this stage, and details, including which American companies will participate and just what they will build in the Philippines, are yet to be determined. The news comes just a month before President Trump is set to meet with China's President Xi Jinping for talks to resolve a trade conflict that escalated last year when Beijing cut off exports of most rare earths minerals. China controls around 90% of rare earth processing and around 70% of lithium-ion battery production. A spokesman for the Chinese embassy in Washington said China opposes any country setting up exclusive trade blocs to disrupt international trade order. China has long played an important and constructive role in keeping the global industrial and supply chains safe and stable, said spokesman Liu Pengyu. The Philippines has sources of nickel, copper, chromite, and cobalt that will both be used by American companies operating there and exported back to the U.S. for manufacturing, Helberg said. The Philippines is among the most mineral-rich countries and the world's second-largest producer of nickel, said Gracelyn Bhaskaran, director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But these reserves don't translate into a reliable supply for U.S. manufacturers, she said, because the country exports raw materials and lacks the processed minerals to plug into tech supply chains. The administration will ask companies to put forward proposals to compete for a spot in building out the hub, giving priority to bids that will help move critical minerals processing and manufacturing off Chinese suppliers. Investment will have to come from private sector companies, not the U.S. government. Legal waters are murky in the Fed fight by Nick Timiraos. At the heart of President Trump's threat to fire Jerome Powell lies an unsettled legal question. When the Fed chair's term expires without a confirmed successor, who gets to decide what happens next? This week, the administration signaled that if no successor is confirmed by May 15th, Powell shouldn't continue as chair. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Tuesday that several people, not just Powell, could serve as the Federal Reserve's interim leader, naming Vice Chair Philip Jefferson and Governor Christopher Waller as alternatives. On Wednesday, Trump went further, saying, "I'll have to fire him if Powell didn't step aside." But last month, Powell staked out his position, announcing he would continue leading the central bank as chair pro tempore if no successor is confirmed on time. "That is what the law calls for," Powell said. "That's what we've done on several occasions, including involving me, and that's what we're going to do in this situation." Powell's forceful public claim to the job is itself a message to the White House. Contesting it would mean yet another courtroom fight over the Fed's independence. His apparent confidence rests on legal arguments the Fed has honed over many decades, even though the law is open to interpretation. The ambiguity has produced dueling legal opinions between the executive branch and the Fed going back to 1978. No court has ever been asked to resolve that dispute. The Senate is set to hold confirmation hearings Tuesday for Kevin Warsh, Trump's nominee to succeed Powell, but it faces a potential delay because Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, has vowed to oppose any nomination until a criminal probe about the Fed's building renovations has been resolved. Since Congress adopted the central bank's current structure in 1935, there have been 5 times where the chair's term has expired before the Senate confirmed who would serve next. Each time, the incumbent chair continued to serve. No president has ever contested the arrangement. The question produced a significant legal dispute only once. In 1978, when the confirmation of Arthur Burns' successor was delayed by several weeks, the Justice Department and the Fed reached opposite conclusions about who had the authority to fill the gap. Carter administration lawyers said the president had the authority to designate an acting chair from among any of the Fed's 7 governors, and Carter issued an order designating Burns as the acting chair. But the Fed disagreed, and 2 senators, including Banking Committee Chairman William Proxmire, amplified the objections. They warned that a president who could designate acting chairman could render meaningless the 4-year term Congress had created for Fed chiefs to insulate them from political pressure. 5 years later, the Reagan White House weighed the same question when considering whether to reappoint then-Chairman Paul Volcker. A 28-year-old White House lawyer named John Roberts, now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote a memo for his bosses that agreed in part with the Carter administration position. But Roberts imposed a critical limit. The president could designate an acting chair only for a short period in an emergency, and only if a nominee was pending before the Senate or about to be submitted. There is pertinent case law to the effect that the president cannot appoint acting officers in the face of statutes requiring Senate confirmation in the absence of an emergency situation, Roberts wrote. The Carter administration's position is also weaker today than when it was written. When the Justice Department issued its view in January 78, the president could designate any sitting governor as chair without Senate approval. A law Congress passed in 1977, which took effect in 79, changed that. It required the chair to be separately confirmed by the Senate. That change significantly undercuts the argument that the president could bypass the Senate by designating an acting chair, said Scott Alvarez, former general counsel at the Fed. The legal landscape has shifted further against the executive branch since then. Congress in 1998 passed the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, which laid out the exclusive circumstances under which the president can temporarily fill agency leadership positions. It specifically excluded multi-member independent commissions like the Fed. Last year, the federal courts in Washington ruled in 3 separate cases that the president likely lacks inherent constitutional authority to designate acting principal officers without Senate confirmation. I think it'd be very hard for the White House to win this one, said Alvarez. A legal challenge could also backfire on Trump. Powell hasn't hidden from current and former colleagues that he would like to leave the Fed when his term as chair ends, but he's also implied that he wouldn't resign his seat on the board if doing so would hand the administration a weapon to further damage the central bank's independence. In other words, Powell and Trump want the same thing, for Powell to leave, but the president's approach could drive Powell to stay. A White House attempt to wrest control of the chairmanship during any vacancy would make it far more likely that Powell remains on the board as a governor, a seat he can hold until January of 2028. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Turning to the opinion pages, Potomac Watch by Kimberly Strassel has Vancing the Night Away. Since becoming vice president, J.D. Vance has been starring in his own version of The Greatest Showman. His performance isn't living up to the advanced billing, and the reviews are growing worse. When does the overexposed Veep take a cue from more successful predecessors? Mr. Vance's struggles were acutely on view these past weeks, and only the latest in a lather, rinse, repeat cycle. He began this round in Budapest with a high-profile speech for the re-election of a MAGA hero, Prime Minister Viktor Orban. On to Pakistan, where he played the central role in negotiations over Iran. Back to the U.S., where in Georgia on Tuesday he spoke to the hottest grassroots group going, Turning Point USA. To quibble with P.T. Barnum, there is definitely such a thing as bad publicity. Mr. Orban lost in a landslide. The Iran talks collapsed, and the headline of Turning Point was that Mr. Vance had little by way of response to the anti-war heckling of President Trump. Being vice president ain't beanbag. No one takes the job for the work, as there isn't much, officially. What few duties the Constitution gives the vice president, presiding over and breaking ties in the Senate, taking over for a dead president, are rarely exercised, while every other job worth doing already has its own cabinet secretary or czar. There's no independent power since the boss calls all the shots. If Mike Rowe had a series called Unrewarding Jobs, this would be the leading segment. Since Walter Mondale, vice presidents have come to view their role as that of top advisor to the president, senior troubleshooter, constant surrogate, head of a few special portfolios. This is all best done diligently and in the president's shadow, with any eye to the only real prize the vice presidency holds, pole position in the next presidential nomination contest. Yet, the question always dogs Veeps, how to proclaim their good work and clinch that nomination. Mr. Vance's approach is all show and all tell. He's everywhere all the time, squeezing out every opportunity to let America know how central he is to the Trump operation and the new Republican coalition. He's at the March for Life, calling for a baby renaissance. He's at the Munich Security Conference, berating European allies. He's in the Oval Office, goading the Ukrainian president into an argument. He's trekking Greenland, threatening to make it America's. He's in Rome, meeting not one but two popes. He's all over the government, rooting out fraud. Mr. Vance's team makes certain the press is all over his schedule. None of it is subtle or second fiddle. Most notable is his insistent need to translate the president in a way that pulls the party toward Mr. Vance's own vision, his more populist takes on deportations, millionaires, cryptocurrency, labor policy, war. The pitch is never quite Trump, it's in very Vance. That and the Veep's refusal to ditch or push back against those who have ditched his own boss. They include big names like Tucker Carlson, but also members of the public. At the Turning Point event, Mr. Vance was given a softball opening to make the moral and strategic case for Mr. Trump's actions in Iran. Instead, he said, "I recognize that young voters do not love the policy we have in the Middle East. Okay, I understand." He then talked about the administration's domestic achievements and encouraged young people to get more involved in this process and demand more from people like me. The answer seemed to be inviting criticism of muscular deterrence. It's a method, to be sure, but it isn't working. At the Conservative Political Action Conference in March, 53% of the attendees said Mr. Vance was their top choice to be the next president. Sounds good, but there's an 8-point drop from the year before, after a full year of showmanship. The most successful vice presidents are those who understand this basic rule. Their fate is tied to that of their boss. A model is Mr. Trump's first vice president, Mike Pence, who spent 4 long and loyal years as the administration's recruiter, legislative liaison, international backup, and the head of key priorities like the National Space Council and the COVID Task Force. That work helped produce a rocking economy, and while Mr. Pence was never front and center, word of his role got out. He was heralded right up till Mr. Trump unfairly turned against him over the 2020 election. Mr. Vance might follow the example of a current prospective rival. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is pursuing the Pence model. Put your head down, do the work, let the results speak. A year ago, 3% of CPAC attendees rated Mr. Rubio their top choice. This time, he got more than 35%. The more Mr. Vance thrusts himself into the fray, hopping up and down for attention, the more Mr. Rubio looks presidential. As Barnum once said, no man has a right to expect to succeed in life unless he understands his business. Veeping isn't for the unstrategic. Jordan McGillis, a fellow at the Economic Innovation Group, has an opinion article called "Equality of the Sexes Widens the Class Divide." What's the secret of affluence? In modern America, high-income households are powered not by a single breadwinner, but by 2 sustained professional careers. The Great Decompression, the phenomenon of incomes rising faster for families above the median, is often blamed on slow wage growth for middle-class men since the 70s. But the rise of educated women is the true driver of the change. 50 years of progress in women's education and career opportunities have led to professional men and women marrying each other, staying in the workforce, and leaving traditional couples behind. Inequality between the sexes has declined, but inequality between classes has increased. The 2-income model is generating significant household wealth. The median 2-income family today earns about $140,000, double what the median single-income family earns. Roughly 30% of 2-income families have an income of more than $200,000 a year, compared with only 11% of single-income families. Today, more than 2/3 of young couples buying homes are dual income. In the 1970s, the opposite was true. But the 2-income model comes with trade-offs, chiefly child care. The median cost in the U.S. to send one child to daycare for 5 years is $44,000. In major cities and suburbs, that price tag can exceed $100,000. Having more children multiplies the cost. This fearsome child care threshold gives an advantage to educated egalitarian families. For all the talk of decline in the college wage premium, the stubborn fact is that college-educated women earn much more money than less-educated members of their cohort. Using 2024 data, working women aged 25 to 34 without a bachelor's degree earn a weighted mean income of $41,063, according to the Census Bureau. Women in the same age group with a bachelor's degree earn $72,456, a 76% premium. Women with degrees can clear the child care challenge that compels less educated mothers to stop working. This pattern shows up in labor force participation statistics. Among married women with children at home and a high school diploma, 60% are employed with some form. Among such women with bachelor degrees, 77% are. Among those with higher degrees, 86% are. There may be some women for whom culture and identity drive labor force attachment, but generally, if a woman's income outpaces childcare costs while she's in her 20s or 30s, she likely has high expected lifetime earnings and has a lot to gain by pursuing her career. When credentialed professional women do exit the labor force after having children, they have on-ramps for return that less educated women don't. Antonia Johnson, an attorney I interviewed, had a child in her late 30s. She took several years off, but has now passed the bar exam in a new state and is again practicing law. Highly educated mothers also enjoy an income compounding effect over their peers. By staying in the labor force during the decade when children are young, these women build experience, earnings growth, and retirement funds that set their families apart financially. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Claudia Golden has found, education raises women's wages as well as the payoff for staying attached to the workforce. Childcare is a large but temporary fixed cost that arrives before carers have fully matured. Yet, labor force exit has enduring consequences. Women who remain attached preserve the economic trajectory of a two-income family that compounds long after childcare costs have diminished. The result is a sorting of families into different long-run paths. The modern affluent household isn't sustained by a single worker, but by two long, uninterrupted careers. That shift is a marker of educational and professional progress, while also a catalyst for class divergence. As high-earning women marry high-earning men and stay in the workforce, families with two professional incomes cluster at the top. Families with one income occupy the middle. Rational choices within families results in the Great Decompression, with deep consequences for the nation's social structure. Here is a quote from Mayor Zoran Mamdani. This is posted by Lisa Flickinger for the New York Post on April 13. Mayor Zoran Mamdani's plan to build a $30 million city-owned grocery store in Harlem next year has stunned supermarket executives who note that the lavishly priced project looks like a threat to the neighborhood's already struggling grocers, the Post has learned. His Honor unveiled his plan to open the first of 5 such taxpayer-funded stores, a cornerstone of his campaign last fall to slash food prices for lower-income residents, during a speech on Sunday morning marking his first 100 days in office. I almost fell back when I saw the $30 million number, Anthony Pena, president of the National Supermarket Association, told the Post. Even a high-end gourmet store in the middle of Manhattan wouldn't cost that much to build. Avi Kaner, the former owner of New York's 17-store Morton Williams grocery chain, said, $30 million is an awful lot to spend building one supermarket. Kaner and Pena both said that a typical 15,000 square foot store without elevators or escalators costs under $10 million to build. In Review and Outlook, how the ABA spreads GEI in law schools. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are supposed to be on their way out of higher education, but the American Bar Association doesn't want to admit it. The Lawyers Guild is still mandating DEI standards that law schools must meet to be accredited. That's the subject of a new report from the conservative nonprofit Defending Education, which works to reduce politics in the classroom. It documents how ABA standards still push law schools to require diversity training as a prerequisite for graduation. In a February 2025 letter to the Council of the Section of Legal Education and Admissions to the Bar, then Attorney General Pam Bondi warned that race preferences, quote, violate the civil rights laws of this country, end quote. Accreditation standards that, quote, require a commitment to diversity encourage compliance through unlawful means, end quote. The ABA suspended Standard 206 and all of its rules of procedure for approval of law schools, which required schools to demonstrate a commitment to diversity and inclusion. But that was only half the problem. The ABA left untouched Standard 303C, which requires law schools to, quote, provide education to law students on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism, end quote, twice before a student graduates. As of April 2026, 72 law schools in 24 states have DEI pages, a rebranded equivalent site, or similar statements publicly available, says the Defending Education report. At Villanova, the DEI page is now called Unitas, Community Building, but still informs visitors that the school is deeply committed to DEI, which can lead to progress in the justice system as well as within society. The University of Colorado, Boulder Law School, rebranded its DEI as Community and Culture. American University Washington College of Law rebranded its DEI shop as the Office of Inclusive Excellence and Leadership Development. Iowa's Drake University Law School rebranded as Collaborative Culture. Others, including the University of Connecticut, Boston College Law School, and University of Michigan, are still promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, according to their report. The ABA has moved to the political left in recent decades, and its near monopoly on law school accreditation lets it steer law schools in the same direction. When a single accreditor controls access to the legal profession, the standards and expectations become entrenched, along with political bias. Law schools have an incentive to align themselves with what they think the ABA wants. The better way is for schools to have alternatives. The Federal Trade Commission has been critical of the ABA's monopoly as the sole accreditor. In a letter to the Supreme Court of Florida, the FTC Office of Policy Planning Bureau of Competition wrote that such control by the ABA is inimical to the principles on which competition law rests. Texas and Florida recently cut ties with the ABA, and Tennessee and Ohio may do the same. The U.S. Education Department's National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity will review the ABA's federal recognition this summer, and the Bar Association should be concerned. It lost its privileged status approving judicial nominees because it couldn't get the political bias out of its ratings. Now it's risking the same as an accreditor. You're listening to the reading of the articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Moving on to the business and finance section, jet fuel's price rise puts Spirit bankruptcy exit at risk, by Allison Sider and Dean Seal. Spirit Airlines is facing a steeper climb out of bankruptcy due to rising fuel prices. The airline is engaged in discussions with creditors, which are exploring options, including a potential liquidation of the airline, people familiar with the matter said. The carrier had reached an agreement with a group of creditors just days before the U.S. and Israel began launching airstrikes against Iran. Now, the company's plans to emerge from Chapter 11 bankruptcy by early summer have gotten more challenging. The lenders behind Spirit's revolving credit line filed an objection to the reorganization plan last week, saying the proposal doesn't account for the airline's sharply higher costs. If debtors cannot demonstrate their viability at current or possibly higher fuel prices, they have no basis to represent that the plan is feasible, attorneys for the lenders wrote in a Friday court filing. Spirit returned to bankruptcy court in August, less than a year after previous Chapter 11 restructuring failed to solve financial challenges presented by its no-frills business model. Jet fuel prices more than doubled in the weeks after the start of the war, and specialists say it will take months before the global supplies start to normalize. The airline said in court documents this month that it expects fuel price volatility to moderate and return to more normal levels in the second half of May. Fuel is one of the airline's biggest expenses, and all airlines are grappling with a sharp increase in their costs. Carriers such as Delta Airlines and United Airlines that cater to well-heeled customers who buy premium tickets have said they believe they can recoup their costs by charging more for tickets. Spirit is more vulnerable. The airline has been shrinking its fleet and pulling out of unprofitable routes as part of its strategy to get back on track. It has also lifted fares in recent weeks. Spirit's costs would balloon by $360 million if jet fuel prices remain high for the rest of the year, J.P. Morgan analysts said in a note last week. The airline had only $337 million in cash at the end of last year, they said. The February reorganization plan would also split a $275 million loan into two separate pieces, a move that breaks the original contract and ignores legal protections meant to keep Spirit's collateral tied together, said Citibank, which represents the lenders. Spirit is already in default of its agreement, Citibank said, and lenders had the right to seize airline assets. Bloomberg reported on Wednesday that Spirit is at risk of being liquidated. On Heard on the Street, we have Mr. Market is off his meds. For anyone who still believes the stock market is totally rational, the past 7 weeks have provided an expensive education. Whatever your opinion about the conflict in Iran, including how much longer it might last, war clearly isn't good for most companies, all else being equal. And all else is pretty much equal over such a short span. Cold fusion wasn't perfected, cancer wasn't cured, and the economy didn't leap into a faster gear. Yet the S&P 500 is higher, energy stocks are lower, and the VIX fear gauge is down since the outbreak of hostilities. How do you explain that, much less act on it? It is tempting to believe that the market knows something you don't, based on collective wisdom of millions of investors. Unless it's your job to tout stocks, though. Don't twist yourself into knots thinking of the reasons. In the same vein, don't assume stocks are wrong and thus headed for a fall either. As finance professor Meyer Stotman put it, the market may be crazy, but that doesn't make you a psychiatrist. There is a difference, though, between erratic behavior on the macro and on the micro level. Jumping in and out of the market entirely is costly. Buying or avoiding a specific stock or sector could be worthwhile if their prices can't be justified. Warren Buffett's mentor, Benjamin Graham, used the parable of a business owner with an emotionally unstable partner, Mr. Market. Some days he might want to buy out your share at a ridiculously high price. Other times, he might want to sell his to you for a song. You could act on that profitably, or just ignore it. Companies can spark temporary insanity by just saying some magic words. The latest, Allbirds, the maker of comfy shoes for the Silicon Valley crowd, recently sold its intellectual property and assets for less than 1% of its peak valuation. Then on Wednesday, its stock surged 582% after the company said it would, quote, pivot its business to an AI compute infrastructure with a long-term vision to become a fully integrated GPU as a service and AI-native cloud solutions provider, end quote. Aha! As disorienting as wild market moves feel, people who invest actively should be relieved. If stock prices were totally rational instead of mostly rational, then there'd be no hope. Who would you rather play poker against, Mr. Market or Mr. Spock? This is by Spencer Jacab. Also, from Heard on the Street, Wall Street spends its windfall on Wall Street. And this is by Telis Demos. Washington has been trying to free up more of the resources of big banks. Banks have wasted no time putting them to work, but on Wall Street rather than Main Street. Big banks lending to consumers and mid-sized companies is moving modestly ahead, but demand for financing has boomed in their Wall Street trading businesses, which serve such clients as private credit funds, hedge funds, and institutional investors. This kind of lending can drive big profits, in part thanks to advantageous regulatory treatment and because it brings in lots of fees for arranging trades, doing deals, and other services. But investors are starting to ask how much further banks can increase their Wall Street revenue, especially with growing risks in the current market, ranging from war to artificial intelligence disruption. For the first quarter, the six biggest U.S. banks reported another surge in trading revenue, collectively up 17% from a year earlier. Those banks are Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo. They also added more of the kinds of assets that fuel those units. The total of average trading-related assets in the first quarter, which includes such things as securities held in trading books as well as repurchase agreements to swap cash for client securities, grew by about 20% from a year earlier across the largest banks that report on those figures. Those banks also are seeing fast growth in lending through their trading desks. That can include loans to non-bank lenders such as private credit funds, which have been a big growth area in recent years. The banks that report loans specifically for their market units increased them by around 1/4 or more from last year. J.P. Morgan Chief Financial Officer Jeremy Barnum told analysts that the bank's markets lending had been the primary driver of wholesale loan growth recently. Many companies and consumers have been cautious as they prepare for such things as higher energy costs, likely affecting their demand for borrowing. Overall consumer loans at the largest banks all climbed by low single-digit percentages in the first quarter over last year. Loans in the bank's reported commercial banking units that primarily serve mid-sized businesses also grew at around that pace. Banks have powered their growth in trading partly by tapping some of the excess capital they built up during the Biden administration. Back then, they were preparing for potentially sizable increases in capital requirements. Now, under new proposals during the Trump administration, some big banks expect to see steady or falling requirements. From the fourth quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of this year, the key ratio of core equity capital as a percentage of risk-weighted assets at the six biggest banks has fallen by more than a percentage point on average. Those capital ratios are still solidly above the bank's minimum requirements, but have reduced excesses over that level. Regulators, meanwhile, last year relaxed a restraint on the largest bank's use of leverage, which in particular helps trading activities that involve warehousing low-risk assets, such as the treasuries. Separately, Wells Fargo was released from its Federal Reserve size cap last year, enabling it to expand its assets. Morgan Stanley told analysts that it strategically deployed leverage-based capital this quarter to help facilitate client activity in our markets franchise. Still, it isn't yet clear if banks' market revenue can keep up the pace in the quarters ahead. For one thing, capital rules remain. J.P. Morgan told analysts on Tuesday that it actually expects to see a 4% increase in required core equity capital under the Fed's most recent proposals. It is still arguing for changes before those rules are completed. Momentum might be growing for company borrowing, too. There was faster pickup sequentially in the company's corporate banking units than in markets lending from the fourth quarter to the first quarter for the three largest banks that report those totals. That uptick is one reason why shares of smaller banks, which tend to be more reliant on company lending, have done well in 2026. The KBW Nasdaq Regional Banking Index is up 7% this year, ahead of the S&P 500's 3% increase. There are also signs that some investors might struggle if the conflict in the Middle East continues. The International Monetary Fund, in a report this week, said that volatility triggered by the conflict heightens the risk that some hedge funds could face margin calls, forced deleveraging, and the unwinding of positions, which can significantly amplify market stress. Several banks cited weakness in interest rate trading revenue, which is one way that some macro traders place bets. That was offset by a jump in commodities trading revenue in the midst of wild oil price swings. A surge in borrowing by trading clients has attracted the scrutiny of regulators and analysts. Tracking by the U.S. Office of Financial Research shows that prime brokerage borrowing by hedge funds about doubled from the start of 2023 to the end of last year. A report this week by S&P Global said that the rapidly expanding balance sheets of hedge funds and proprietary trading firms, fueled by markets financing from banks, is creating risks for major global banks and our ratings. Meanwhile, some private credit funds are facing redemption from requests from investors. Banks said this lending is heavily collateralized and protected from all but the most extreme credit losses. Still, a slowdown in that activity could eat into revenue growth. A boost in lending and financing in that business can help damp the natural ups and downs of markets, but it can also add exposure to risks that investors are now straining to understand. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Abbott Laboratories has cut its outlook after mild flu season by Connor Hart. Abbott Laboratories has cut its full-year earnings outlook to account for a recent acquisition and said a weaker-than-expected flu season hurt its recent quarter. The medical products maker said Thursday that it now expected adjusted earnings of $5.38 to $5.58 a share for the year. That compares with the prior outlook of $5.55 to $5.80 a share, and it's below the $5.60 a share that analysts had forecast, according to FactSet. Abbott attributed the lower outlook to its acquisition of cancer diagnostics company Exact Sciences, which was completed last month and is expected to dent adjusted earnings by 20 cents a share. The acquisition was completed earlier than expected, resulting in a headwind of 2 cents a share during the first quarter and requiring Abbott to take out loans sooner than anticipated. J.P. Morgan analysts said profit fell in the recent period as sales of certain diagnostic tests were stymied by the mild respiratory season. Abbott shares closed down 6% at $95.47. Despite the near-term earnings hit, Chief Executive Robert Ford said the Exact Science acquisition will accelerate Abbott's long-term sales growth rate. The purchase is expected to add about $3 billion of incremental sales this year. That is $1 billion. Sales of Abbott's rapid and molecular diagnostic tests fell 7.4% during the recent quarter. Despite the drag, sales across the company's broader diagnostics unit were up 6.1%. Abbott's first quarter profit fell to $1.08 billion, or 61 cents a share, from $1.33 billion, or 76 cents a share, a year earlier. Sales increased 7.8% to $11.16 billion and topped Wall Street models for $11 billion. Sharon Turlip reports that Ford seeks deeper China ties. Ford Motor plans to expand partnerships with Chinese manufacturers abroad, while also opening the door to one day allowing Chinese cars in the U.S. Chief Executive Jim Farley said the U.S. and automakers need a plan to protect American jobs before Chinese auto imports and production arrive, but Ford must tie up with Chinese manufacturers overseas to maintain a global edge. They're really leading the world in many ways when you look at the technology and the cost and the speed of what they're doing, he said. Countries that permitted Chinese exports too quickly and without a plan saw their factories and their jobs vanish, Farley said. Having a plan before we go fast, either in local production or imports from China, is the most important moment. We're in that moment right now. Farley's remarks are the strongest sign to date that U.S. automakers are adjusting to the rapid advance of Chinese companies and seeking to partner with them rather than simply stave them off. Ford will expand partnerships with Chinese companies outside the U.S., Farley said, because we want to bring the best vehicles to market wherever it makes sense. Inside the U.S., he said, Ford aims to figure out how to better compete. The executive pointed to China as well as Japan and South Korea, which both allow the sale of Chinese cars, as examples of countries that successfully safeguarded their domestic auto industries. His comments come a day after he said in an interview on Fox News that Chinese automakers would devastate the U.S. auto industry and shouldn't be allowed in. "There's no way this is a fair fight," he said in the interview. China's low-cost, high-tech cars have registered explosive growth around the globe, swallowing up market share wherever they're sold. Their rise has been a source of deep angst for U.S. car executives who say they can't compete on production costs and vehicle technologies that are heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. Farley has long been vocal on the existential threat posed by Chinese producers, simultaneously admiring their automotive prowess and warning they would upend the U.S. market if allowed in. The U.S. has imposed hefty tariffs on imports of Chinese-made vehicles while banning Chinese connected vehicle software in cars to keep the cars out of the U.S. market. Farley's remarks made Wednesday to reporters suggest the automaker has come to accept Chinese rivals' march while securing time to bolster its own operations to better withstand the entry of China-made competitors. Ford has joined other U.S. and foreign automakers in calling for the Trump administration to keep the car makers out of the market, citing potential threats to national security and global competitiveness. In the U.S., Farley said, Ford must learn to compete with Chinese rivals. That's the idea behind the automaker's plan to upend its manufacturing system and replace it with a new type of assembly line slated to begin turning out affordable EVs by next year. Another bit of U.S. news by Terrell Wright and Michelle Hackman is that the House votes to reinstate protections for Haitians. The House passed a bipartisan measure that would reinstate temporary legal protection for Haitian immigrants living in the U.S., with 11 members of the Republican conference breaking with the Trump administration to side with the Democrats on the measure. The 224 to 204 vote marks a rare GOP rebuke of President Trump's agenda. Trump maligned Haitian immigrants on the campaign trail and moved to strip their legal protections, known as temporary protected status, soon after taking office. The bill will head to the Senate, where the prospects for a vote are unclear. Roughly 350,000 Haitians are covered by the program, which offers them work permits and a shield from deportation while it's in effect. After Trump revoked the status for Haitians, their protections were set to expire in February, though the termination of the program has been halted pending a Supreme Court case this term. The bill passed by the House would extend TPS protections for Haitians by law for another 3 years. It wouldn't address Trump's revocation of TPS protections for immigrants from other countries, including Venezuela, Honduras, and Afghanistan. Haitian TPS holders are not the problem. Quite the contrary. They are part of the solution. They are not our enemies. They do not exploit our nation. They enhance it, said Representative Ayanna Pressley, a Democrat of Massachusetts. New York Republican Representative Mike Lawler introduced the measure with Representative Laura Gillen, Democrat of New York. Lawler, who has defended Haitian immigrants in his Hudson Valley constituency, holds one of the most vulnerable Republican-held seats in the House. Nebraska Republican Representative Don Bacon, who's retiring, voted for the measure. He said the removal of temporary protected status would affect workplaces in Nebraska, including in the healthcare industry, that are already facing serious staff shortages. I don't see the goodness of deporting people who are here legally working and contributing to our country, Bacon said in a social media post. Other Republicans disagreed. The only discharge petition I will support is the one that discharges all of these people back to Haiti, said Representative Randy Fine, Republican of Florida, on the House floor before the vote. The measure would likely face a veto by Trump, whose Department of Homeland Security had moved to end the protections for Haitians. Later this month, the Supreme Court is hearing a case on the administration's continued plan to end TPS protection for Haitians and Syrians, though the case's outcome could have implications for the up to 1.3 million immigrants in the U.S. currently covered by the status. Those interested in international soccer news would be interested in an article by Ryan Duray about a trial in Argentina probing Maradona's 2020 death. I'll begin reading this, and then anyone who wishes to hear more of it can call the station at 716-821-5555 to hear the rest of it. It will be read to you by staff. For almost 6 years, Argentines have demanded the truth about the mysterious death of their tragic national hero, Diego Maradona, among the greatest soccer players the world has ever seen. Now, prosecutors say they have an answer and are putting their evidence to the test this week in a trial accusing Maradona's medical team of, quote, simple homicide with eventual intent, end quote, meaning that their actions contributed to his death. 7 defendants, including Maradona's doctor and nurses and a psychiatrist, face as many as 25 years in prison. Prosecutors alleged Maradona's medical team ignored significant warning signs as his health deteriorated in late 2020. They have described the house where he was recovering from brain surgery as a theater of horrors. They abandoned Diego Armando Maradona to his fate, condemned to death, prosecutor Patricio Ferrari said in his opening remarks on Tuesday. The case has gripped Argentina, with some of his fans holding up signs outside the Buenos Aires court demanding justice for God, a reference to Maradona's status as a demigod. Before his November 25th, 2020 death by a heart attack, Maradona's belly had swollen like a beach ball, and his heart was covered in fat and blood clots. In his final hours, he was likely in agony, a medical board convened by prosecutors said. So if you want to hear more about this, please call the station, 716-821-5555, and staff will be happy to read it to you. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, April 17th issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. and Friday at 6 p.m. Your reader has been Dasha. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the Buffalo Criterion, followed at 8 o'clock by the New York Times, and at 9 o'clock by Buffalo Spree. Stay with us for these readings and more throughout the day. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes